everyone, this is Shannie from Baker Creek, and today we're going to be talking about planting for a fall harvest. A lot of people get confused. They think fall planting maybe happens in the fall. In reality, fall harvest means you're going to be planting in the middle of the summer. So maybe you've just pulled your garlic out in July, or you've cleared out some of those spring crops and you have some open space in your garden and you'd like to plant things like carrots or beets or maybe Brussels sprouts or broccoli, and you want them to mature in the fall so that you can have lots of beautiful meals through the winter and the fall months. So we're going to teach you today about planting for harvest in the fall. So as beginner gardeners, sometimes we get a little fatigued by the middle of the summer and we don't take advantage of the fall planting window in the midsummer. So I want to teach you guys some of the most basic concepts for starting a fall planted garden. I want to see you guys with a beautiful bounty through the fall and winter months, and this is how you're going to do it. So the most crucial factor when planting for a fall harvest is timing. You're going to want to find out a few different dates and days before you get to planting. The most important, and firstly, you're going to want to figure out your first fall frost date. You may not know what that is at this point. Maybe you're a brand new gardener and this is your first season and you don't know when to expect your first frost. So you can actually find that information online. You can find it on the Farmer's Almanac. There are a number of resources where you can find out, depending on your zip code or your county or location, when to expect your first frost. Here in Missouri, in the Ozarks, we can usually expect our first frost to be around October 17th, but that can range. Next, you're going to want to pick the crops that you're going to grow and find out how many days to maturity those crops are going to need. Days to maturity means how many days from planting the seed until harvest that plant is going to need to grow. For example, things like Brussels sprouts need 90 to 100 days, while things like radishes and cilantro only need about 20 days, sometimes less. There's a huge range. So you want to take into consideration the date of your first frost and how many days to maturity your crop is going to have. And that's going to help you count back on your calendar to determine the day that you need to plant your crop. Also, be sure to keep in mind that the autumn sun is a lot less strong than the early summer sun. So you're going to actually add about a week to actually 2 weeks to your days to maturity to really get an accurate read on how many days your plant is going to take to harvest. For example, if you have Brussels sprouts that are going to take 100 days, you're going to actually add 12 days to that, 12 to 14 days to that, to really get an accurate measure on how many days it will truly take. Plants grow slower during this time of the season. So let's go over timing once more. First, it's so important to find out your first frost date. Second, figure out the days to maturity on each crop that you plan to grow. Third, add 2 weeks because it's going to be much slower growing for this latter half of the season. And fourth, it's important to figure out whether your crop can handle cool weather or if it's going to need to be pulled out of the ground by the time of that first frost, because that's going to determine when you're going to plant your crop. So one of the most important considerations for planting midsummer for a fall harvest is to think about the soil temperature. It's very different than when you're planting in the spring. When you plant in the spring, the soil is cool and it's typically pretty moist. When you're planting in high summer, that soil is already warmed up quite a bit and it can be dry very easily. This is sometimes, for some regions, the driest part of the year. So you want to keep that into consideration. There are tricks that you can implement to keep your plants cool so that they can survive the early hot part of their growing stages, and then as the season cools off, they'll really take off and grow with ease. So the first thing you can do is establish microclimates in your garden. This is important for any kind of gardening technique. You want to take a walk around your garden and figure out where's the coolest part of your garden. It's probably the north-facing side. It's probably an area maybe under the shade of a shade-casting tall plant like a sunflower, or maybe some corn stalks. Maybe you have a wall of corn, but establish a shady zone, a cooler zone, or maybe a more moist area in your garden. And those are going to be places that are ideal to set up your midsummer planting for fall harvest. For example, putting your lettuce crop right at the base of your corn plants where they're casting shade is great. Lettuce does not like to germinate in the super hot midsummer heat, but if it's in a shaded area or it's kept nicely moist, it's going to do much better. Unable to identify a cooler microclimate in your garden, you can always create one. Try investing in a little bit of shade cloth. You can get dark shade cloth, you can get the shade cloth with reflective outer side. Whatever you choose, this is going to cool down your soil significantly and help your crops that may be a little bit more on the cool weather loving side to get established until the weather truly cools off in your area. And some crops just need to be started indoors and transplanted out when the weather gets a little bit cooler. And I'm specifically talking about brassicas when I mention this. So anything in the cabbage family, which would be cabbage, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, anything in that family is going to do much better if you start it in a cool space indoors, maybe just a sunny window, maybe your greenhouse, anywhere you can get the plants established in a tray, in a pot, and in a cooler area, maybe out of the direct and intense sun. Get those plants to get established indoors in a cooler area or a shade house, and then transplant them out when the weather is cooled off just a bit and the plants are about 4 inches tall and nice and established with a good root system. Be sure, once you get them in the ground, to get them really well watered and keep them well watered. That's essential. Irrigation is a really important consideration for planting for a fall harvest. You've got the hottest part of the season right now and your soil is quite warm. Now, irrigating is going to help dramatically. It's going to help cool the soil, and in this droughty time of year, it's going to help germination a lot. So trying things like a drip irrigation system to have consistent moisture released throughout the day is essential. Overhead watering can help, but a drip system is ideal. Another way to ensure that your midsummer soil doesn't get too hot or dry is to apply a good layer of mulch. Mulch is going to help protect against temperature fluctuations and moisture fluctuations. It's going to lock the moisture in the soil. It's going to keep it cooler and more consistent, and that means less stress for your plants. So don't pile the mulch directly up against the plants. Give them a bit of space, but a nice thick layer, a few inches of mulch is going to be so helpful in keeping more consistent conditions for your plants during that young and really vulnerable time when they're just getting established. So just to recap, keep those plants cool. How are you going to do it? Apply mulch, consistent watering, long, deep drinks of water. Find your microclimate and plant your cool, loving crops in the coolest part of your garden. And if need be, bring some shade cloth into the garden and create your own microclimate. One big factor, probably one of the biggest challenges of planting in midsummer for a fall harvest, is the pest pressure. Now, when you plant in the early spring, the pests are just waking up and coming into their life cycles. But in the midsummer, you've got full-blown pest populations. So you're really going to want to implement some preventative measures with your plants, because you're going to have young, vulnerable plants just a few inches tall, and then a pest population that's at its peak. So when those plants are really young, that's going to be the most challenging time where you really have to stay on top of your pest population. So one of the first things is to provide a physical barrier. This can be anything from row cover to netting, and you can even use shade cloth, but it's a way to physically keep the bugs away from your plants. You just have to be really vigilant with these physical barriers and not open them to pest exposure accidentally, because if they get up under that cover, they're going to become a problem. Don't forget, you can do things like companion planting to discourage pests. So adding a few calendula or marigold plants in between your vegetable patch is going to help ward off some of those pests. There are organic sprays that you can spray, especially preventatively. Things like capsicum, which is just derived from hot peppers, that you can start spraying when the plants are quite young. It's just a foliar spray that you apply, and that's going to really prevent those leaf-biting insects. So for protecting against pests, again, remember, try a physical barrier like a shade cloth or an Agribon row cover or netting, or try something like a preventative spray. You can use things like kaolin clay or capsicum hot pepper oil, things like that. Also, interplanting things like marigolds and calendulas will help tremendously in keeping the pest pressure down. So just a few of my favorite summer planted, fall harvested crops are things like Asian greens. Asian greens are probably my #1 favorite green to plant in the high season for harvest in fall. They love cool weather. They're going to take on a really nice, complex, sweet flavor as the weather cools down, and they're densely nutritious. They're going to give you salads all fall, and if you give them a little bit of protection, if you live in a cooler climate and you get a hard frost, they can even grow through the winter. Now, if you have a more mild climate, they're going to grow right into the winter. They're a really versatile, delicious, nutritious crop. Things like brassicas taste so much better when you harvest them in the fall, and they tend to have less pest issues when they mature and are harvested in cooler weather because most of the pests have died off by then. Root crops like carrots and beets are going to store nicely right into the winter, and they're going to provide beautiful nutrition throughout the winter. And they actually take on a nice sweet flavor as they get exposed to a little bit of frost. So they're going to even get better as you harvest them through the fall. So I can't wait to see you guys plant these beautiful midsummer gardens and have awesome fall harvest veggies throughout the fall and the winter. It just takes a few steps, consideration, and a little bit of math, getting those dates and times correct, and you're gonna have an amazing fall harvest.